It was a cold, rainy spring night in March 2024, when deputies from the Scott County Sheriff's Office were called to the scene of a car accident, just 7 miles north of downtown Davenport, Iowa. The streets were slick with rain, and the heavy wind seemed to carry a certain unease through the air. Visibility was low, and the floodlights from the police cars barely cut through the dark, making the scene feel almost surreal. A silver Impala had crashed into a concrete median before striking a light pole, its front end crumpled, smoke rising from the engine, and the rain washing away any trace of the chaos that had just occurred. Deputy Thomas Leonard approached the scene cautiously. The sounds of the storm were deafening, but there was something eerily quiet about the moment, something that set his instincts on edge. The car, though badly damaged, appeared to be empty of life. No blood, no obvious signs of trauma. It seemed like a routine case, another drunk driver caught in the act, a minor accident caused by bad weather. But as Leonard walked closer to the car, things began to feel off. Inside the car sat 31-year-old Christopher Beal, the driver, slumped over in the seat. His eyes were unfocused, and a distinct smell of alcohol lingered in the air around him. His body language was erratic, his speech slurred. His incoherent responses to Leonard's questions only heightened the unease that had begun to settle over the scene. "Are you okay?" Leonard asked, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. I don't know where I am," Beal mumbled, his words faltering as his eyes glazed over. "I think I was going to the auditorium." His confusion seemed more than just intoxication. It felt as though he was lost in time, disoriented, struggling to make sense of reality. But it was what Leonard found next that would take the investigation down a much darker path. As he attempted to assess Beal's condition, the deputy noticed something chilling. A knife, its blade partially visible, lay near Beal's bare feet, soaked in blood. The deputy's heart skipped a beat, but his professional calm kept him from reacting immediately. Beal seemed oblivious to it, his mind far from the reality of what was happening. At first, deputies dismissed it as a minor injury, perhaps an accident. But the small details, the blood and the knife, were whispers of something far more sinister, something just beyond the surface waiting to be uncovered. And Leonard couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple accident. Not by a long shot. The rain continued to pour relentlessly as Beal sat slumped in the sterile white of the hospital room. His body was heavy, his mind clouded by alcohol, yet fragments of memories began to stir in the depths of his foggy consciousness. It wasn't the usual haze of intoxication. No, this felt different. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. As the minutes passed, he blinked, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of his mind. The echoes of images, broken snapshots of a violent scene, started to creep in. Flashbacks came and went. His hands gripping something cold, harsh words exchanged, the sound of a struggle. Each memory was like a jagged puzzle piece that didn't quite fit together, but they all shared one common thread: violence. He turned to Deputy Leonard, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. "You need to check on Taylor," Beal muttered, his voice shaky. "Taylor? She's in trouble. I think I hurt her." The deputy froze, a shiver running down his spine. Taylor Escontrias. Beal's girlfriend. Taylor had been on his mind ever since he woke up in the hospital, but it was only now, with the fog lifting from his mind, that the pieces started to fall into place. "What do you mean?" Leonard asked, his voice calm but the tension clear beneath. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I don't know," Beal whispered, his eyes distant, searching the walls as if the answers were hidden there. "I see pictures. Images in my head. But they're not clear. They're violent. I think I might have hurt her. I need you to go check on her. Please." His voice cracked with a mix of fear and desperation, but there was something in his tone, something that seemed to suggest he wasn't fully aware of the gravity of his words. The deputy's instincts screamed that something wasn't adding up. Here was a man who had crashed his car, seemingly too drunk to even recall where he was heading. Yet now, in the midst of his disorientation, he was speaking with chilling certainty about harming his girlfriend. Leonard exchanged a look with his partner, then turned back to Beal. "What happened, Chris? Why do you think you hurt her?" But Beal only shook his head, the confusion overtaking him again. I don't remember. Just, something's not right. Something's wrong with her. I need to know she's okay." As Leonard stared at the man before him, the faintest realization started to settle in. Beal wasn't just a man drunk and confused after a car accident. His mind was struggling to remember something darker, something far more sinister than a simple wreck. And those images in his head, they weren't just drunken ramblings. They were pieces of a nightmare. A nightmare that, if true, would lead to an unimaginable horror. Deputy Leonard, sensing the urgency of the situation, made the call to return to the Crestview apartments. But as he grabbed his radio, a gnawing suspicion tightened in his gut. Was Beale's confusion a facade? Or was there a deeper truth buried beneath the haze of alcohol and fragmented memories? The only way to find out was to return to the apartment, and pray they were not too late. Taylor Escontrias was 31 years old, a vibrant woman with a soul that burned brightly despite the shadows that often loomed over her life. Born and raised in Davenport, Iowa, Taylor had always been known for her creativity, whether it was through her art, her cooking, or the way she could light up a room with her infectious laughter. She had 2 young children, Lila and Julian, who were the center of her world, and though she was a loving mother, life had dealt her its share of painful cards. Her journey had been far from easy. Taylor had battled with addiction for much of her adult life, struggling to break free from the clutches of alcohol that had slowly consumed her. But despite her personal demons, those who knew her spoke of her kindness and resilience. She had an innate ability to care for others, even when she couldn't quite care for herself. She would often take refuge in her family, surrounded by the love of her mother, Lisa, and her stepfather, Michael. But no matter how much they tried to help, the weight of her addiction was always there, lurking beneath the surface. Taylor's path to recovery seemed to be her brightest hope, yet it was a journey fraught with setbacks. After several failed attempts at sobriety, Taylor enrolled in a rehabilitation program at Country Oaks, a facility in Buffalo, Iowa. It was there, in the quiet halls of the center, that she met Christopher Beale. At first, their bond was that of 2 people struggling with the same affliction, alcohol. But as the days went by, their connection deepened. They supported each other through their darkest moments, their shared experiences in rehab giving way to an undeniable chemistry. In October 2023, after completing their program, Taylor and Beale made a public announcement. They were officially a couple. For the first time in a long while, Taylor felt a glimmer of hope. She was sober, or at least trying to be, and she had found someone who understood her. They moved in together, taking up residence in the Crestview apartments, where they would begin what Taylor hoped would be a fresh start. But the demons never fully let go. As time passed, both Taylor and Beale relapsed, slipping back into the grip of alcohol. Their relationship, while built on a foundation of shared pain, became a fragile thing, volatile and unpredictable. Yet even in their darkest moments, there was always a sense that they could help each other heal. There were good days where laughter echoed through their apartment, and days filled with quiet reflection on their past mistakes. But in the background, the cracks began to show. Taylor's struggles with addiction, paired with the fragility of her relationship with Beale, set the stage for a tragedy that no one could have predicted. The love they shared was poisoned by their mutual dependence on alcohol, and as their bond grew stronger, so did the tension. Taylor wanted to believe in the promise of a new life, but the reality of her situation was becoming harder and harder to escape. Their relationship, built on fragile hopes and shared pain, was about to unravel in the most horrific way, one that would forever alter the lives of those who loved Taylor, and perhaps reveal just how far the darkness had already crept into Beale's soul. The storm raged on as Deputy Leonard and his partner drove back to the Crestview apartments, the weight of the situation bearing down on them with each passing minute. The rain continued to batter their squad car, the windshield wipers working overtime to cut through the blur of water that veiled the world outside. The air felt thick with anticipation, and yet, as they pulled into the parking lot, there was an unsettling calm about the scene before them. The apartment complex stood still, its dark windows and quiet halls belying the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. They parked near the building and walked up to the door of Unit 4, Taylor and Beale's apartment. Leonard's heart raced as he reached for the doorbell, his mind whirling with questions. Something felt off. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Beale's fragmented memories weren't just the result of a night spent drowning in alcohol. Was it possible that something had happened to Taylor? And if so, why had she not answered the door when deputies had knocked earlier? He rang the doorbell again, his patience wearing thin as the seconds ticked by. The silence that followed felt deafening. No footsteps. No movement. Not a sound. Just the steady hum of the storm outside, the eerie quiet inside, and the unsettling sense that something was terribly wrong. Taylor? It's the police, Leonard called out, trying once more. His voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no response. He glanced at his partner, whose face mirrored his own unease. Leonard pulled out his phone and dialed Taylor's number, the ringing tone filling the quiet air. It rang once, twice, then the familiar click of voicemail. "Hi, this is Taylor. I can't come to the phone right now." Her voice was calm, but it felt haunting now, knowing what they suspected might have happened inside. The deputies exchanged a look, both silently weighing their options. They stood outside the apartment for a moment longer, unsure of what to do. "We need to go inside," Leonard said finally, his voice filled with uncertainty. But as they moved toward the door to force entry, something stopped them. They both turned to look at Beale, who stood nearby, his face pale, his hands trembling. I don't remember much," Beale said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But something's wrong. I can feel it. You need to check on her. I need to know if she's okay." His words, although shaky, were laced with something that Leonard couldn't ignore: fear. The kind of fear that wasn't just born from drunken confusion. Beale's eyes were wide, his pupils darting, as though his mind was desperately trying to hold on to something more. "I keep seeing things. Flashbacks. There's something in my head that won't go away. I don't think she's okay." The deputies hesitated, their instincts torn between professional duty and the growing sense of dread that had begun to cloud the air. They had no concrete reason to break down the door. They had no reason to believe that anything had happened, at least not yet. But Beale's words, the fear in his voice, sent a chill down Leonard's spine. Something wasn't right. And as the rain pounded against the pavement, the silence of the apartment seemed to grow louder, a foreboding omen of the darkness that might be waiting behind that door. With one last glance at Beale, Leonard made his decision. "We'll go check," he said, motioning for his partner to follow. The air felt thick as they approached the door, and with each step, the tension inside their chests mounted. They pushed the door open, their flashlights cutting through the darkened apartment as they stepped inside. The silence within was suffocating. The air inside the apartment was thick with tension as Deputy Leonard and his partner stepped across the threshold. The door, once locked, now creaked open with an unsettling ease. Their flashlights sliced through the dark, their beams trembling slightly as the weight of the moment settled on their shoulders. At first glance, the apartment seemed ordinary, nothing more than a cluttered living space filled with signs of everyday life. But as they moved deeper into the apartment, something was different. The quiet, that unsettling silence from before, hung in the air like a warning. And then they saw it. Near the entrance, just past the threshold of the door, lay the lifeless body of Taylor Escontrias. She was sprawled on the floor, her body contorted at an unnatural angle. The scene was one of pure violence, her clothes torn, her skin marred with bruises and cuts. Blood had soaked into the carpet beneath her, and it was immediately clear that Taylor had fought fiercely for her life. Her body was a testament to that struggle, signs of a brutal attack that had unfolded in multiple places within the apartment. A baseball bat, stained with blood, was carelessly tossed onto the nearby couch. Its presence, ominous and unmistakable, was the first sign of the violence that had taken place here. But it was far from the only weapon used in the attack. A knife, its blade glinting in the weak light, was discarded near the kitchen counter. Beside it, a screwdriver, its tip also covered in blood, lay abandoned on the floor. The weapons seemed to have been switched out mid-attack, each one a brutal extension of the rage that had consumed the assailant. The chaos of the scene was overwhelming. It wasn't confined to a single location. Blood stained multiple rooms, smears across the hallway, splatters on the walls, and pools of it near the kitchen. The struggle had moved from one space to another, as if the attack had spiraled out of control. There was no singular site of violence. The entire apartment had become a battleground. The sheer brutality of the scene left the deputies momentarily paralyzed, their hearts heavy with the horror of it all. Leonard's flashlight fell upon Taylor's face, twisted in an expression of sheer terror frozen in time. Her eyes were wide open, though they no longer saw. The brutality of her death was unmistakable. The pieces of evidence spoke volumes. Each wound, each weapon, and each piece of broken furniture told a story of unimaginable rage and torment. The deputies stood frozen for a moment, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. The silence that followed was suffocating. They had known this was coming, but even now, the horror of what had unfolded here was nearly impossible to comprehend. And then the full weight of it hit Leonard like a punch to the gut. He thought back to the moments before when Beale had insisted something was wrong, when he spoke of flashes of memory and violent images in his head. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the story was far darker than they could have imagined. As the crime scene investigators arrived, the detectives began to piece together the story. But even then, questions lingered in the air, unanswered and unsettling. How had it happened? What had triggered such a savage act? And most chilling of all, Had Beale in his intoxicated state truly not remembered what he had done? The horror that had unfolded within these walls was only the beginning. And as the investigation progressed, it became clear that the answers would be just as shocking as the scene before them. The sterile, cold room felt more like a confessional than an interrogation space. Christopher Beale sat across from Detective Leonard and his partner, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead casting a clinical glow on his face. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollow with the aftereffects of alcohol, but now, hours after the crash, he was sober. The fog of intoxication had lifted, but his mind remained a fractured puzzle, unable to piece together the events of the night. He sat there, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze shifting uneasily between the detectives. I don't remember everything, Beale said, his voice low and hesitant. It's all a blur. I know something happened. I feel it. His words trailed off as if even he wasn't sure what he was trying to say. Detective Leonard leaned forward, trying to catch Beale's eye, attempting to break through the wall of confusion. You're saying you don't remember what happened between you and Taylor? Leonard asked, his tone firm but patient. You don't remember the argument? Beale shook his head, his expression clouded with confusion. No, I don't. But I remember. I remember feeling like I had to do something. Like I just snapped. We were arguing and then I don't know. He faltered again, the words falling out of him like the last pieces of a shattered dream. The detectives exchanged a brief, questioning glance. Beale's admission wasn't enough, it wasn't clear. He kept saying he snapped, as though it was just an instinct, a reaction he had no control over. But there was something about his words, something unsettling. Did he truly not remember? Or was he hiding something? Was he using the blackout excuse as a shield? Did you hurt her on purpose, Chris? Leonard asked, his voice steady, though the tension was thick in the air. Beale's hands clenched involuntarily as he shifted in his seat. I don't know, Beale whispered, almost pleading. I didn't want to hurt her. I loved her. But I think I did it to put her out of her misery. His voice trembled as the words left his lips, and he closed his eyes as if the very thought pained him. We were fighting so much and I thought, she was in so much pain I thought maybe it was the only way, to stop it. To end it. The detectives paused, letting the weight of Beale's confession hang in the room. The words to put her out of her misery echoed, chilling in their simplicity. How could anyone, believe that such an extreme act was the solution? It wasn't just the brutality of the murder that sent a shiver down their spines, but Beale's rationalization of it. Leonard pressed on. You said you snapped. Was there something that triggered it? Something specific? Was it the alcohol? Was it the argument? Beale's face contorted in frustration as he tried to grasp at the pieces of his memory. I don't know. I don't know what triggered it. I wasn't thinking clearly. I remember her getting upset. I remember her saying things, making me feel like I wasn't enough, like I wasn't part of her life. And I just lost it. I can't remember the rest. I don't remember the details. The detectives exchanged another glance. Beale's admission was disturbingly vague. His memory was too unreliable, too fragmented, for them to piece together what truly happened. Could he really have blacked out during the murder? Or was he lying, spinning a web of confusion to mask his guilt? They couldn't trust him completely, and yet they couldn't ignore what he'd said. Do you remember anything after the attack? Leonard asked. Do you remember leaving the apartment? Beale looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. I remember leaving. I remember the crash. The pole. I don't know why I was there. I thought I was at the hospital. I thought she was with me. He seemed almost apologetic, but his words felt hollow, detached from the brutality they had just uncovered. The detectives sat back, both of them deeply unsettled. Beale's story, his confession, was as fractured as his memories, but his disturbing speculation about putting her out of her misery was something they couldn't simply ignore. It was as if he was still trying to justify the unthinkable, to convince himself that it was somehow the right thing to do. As they continued the interrogation, one thing was certain. Beale's mind was a labyrinth of confusion, but the horror he had been part of was becoming clearer by the minute. The more he spoke, the more the detectives realized that the truth might be even darker than they feared. The case was far from over, and Beale's shifting recollections only added to the growing mystery. The real question now was, what did Beale truly remember? And perhaps more chillingly, what was he hiding? The interrogation room felt suffocating as Christopher Beale continued to sit before Detective Leonard, his eyes darting nervously between the two officers. His story had already begun to unravel, but with each passing moment, his recollection seemed more fractured and contradictory. Every answer seemed to raise more questions than it answered, and the inconsistencies in his narrative were impossible to ignore. I only used the baseball bat, Beale said, his voice unsteady, his hands fidgeting in his lap. That's all I remember. Just the bat. I don't know what happened after that. I can't remember. Detective Leonard paused, his gaze fixed firmly on Beale. He was already well aware of the evidence they had uncovered. The bloodied baseball bat, yes, but also the knife and screwdriver, both found scattered around the apartment. It was impossible to ignore the brutality of the scene, the viciousness of the attack that had taken place in multiple rooms of the apartment, suggesting a struggle that had escalated. Beale's insistence on only remembering the bat didn't line up with what the evidence was telling them. We found more than just a baseball bat, Chris, Leonard said, his voice calm but firm. We found a knife, covered in blood. We found a screwdriver also with blood. They were used during the attack. Do you really expect us to believe you don't remember those? Beale's eyes shifted, his face a mask of confusion, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something darker, something that hinted at the possibility that he wasn't as unaware as he claimed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the words. I don't know about the knife. Or the screwdriver, he mumbled, his voice trailing off as if he couldn't quite piece together the missing fragments. I didn't use those. I just remember the bat. The detective could feel the tension rising in the room, a weight growing heavier with every passing second. Beale's denial was growing increasingly thin, and the story he was weaving seemed to shift with every new question posed. How could he be so certain about the baseball bat but have no recollection of the other weapons? It didn't make sense. It was as if he was selectively choosing what to remember or perhaps more chillingly what to admit. Leonard pressed on. Chris, you're telling me that you used just the bat and that's all you remember? But the crime scene, Taylor's body, shows a different story. The evidence doesn't lie. Beale's gaze faltered, and his hands began to tremble. I don't remember, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe I did. I don't know. Maybe I blacked out. But I never meant to hurt her. I swear. The detectives exchanged a glance. The more Beale spoke, the more his story seemed to disintegrate, leaving only a web of half-truths and contradictions. He was either a man struggling to piece together the truth after a drunken blackout or a man desperately trying to manipulate the situation to fit his narrative. You said you blacked out, Chris. But you remember enough to say that you used a bat. You remember enough to insist that you didn't use the knife or the screwdriver. Does that sound like someone who's forgotten what happened? Or does it sound like someone who's lying about the details? Leonard asked, his voice colder now, the patience in his tone wearing thin. Beale flinched at the question, his face contorting with discomfort. His breath quickened, his chest rising and falling rapidly as though he were struggling to maintain control. The conflicting emotions, fear, guilt, confusion, flashed across his face, making it impossible to discern the truth. I don't remember, okay? He snapped, his voice rising. I don't remember. I think I just lost control. I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't want to do it. I swear I loved her. But I just snapped. The detectives watched in silence, both men processing the raw emotion in Beale's voice. But underneath that emotion something felt off. His words were desperate, yes, but they also felt rehearsed. How many times had he told himself this story? How many times had he tried to convince himself that his actions weren't premeditated, that it wasn't his fault? The room seemed to close in on Beale as the detectives remained silent. His mind was clearly spinning, but was it a spin of guilt, or was it the calculated spin of a man caught in his own web of lies? The tension was palpable. Leonard knew they needed more than just Beale's word. They needed the truth. But as the minutes stretched on, it became increasingly clear. Whether or not Beale remembered the full extent of what he had done, he was hiding something. And the question now was, how much of it was he willing to admit? The investigation had taken a dark turn, and the truth was slipping further away with every word Beale spoke. As the investigation continued to unfold, a chilling piece of the puzzle began to emerge. Detective Leonard sat at his desk, combing through Taylor Escontrias' phone records and messages. Each text, each conversation, seemed to speak louder than the last, painting a picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The first message came in the early evening, hours before Taylor's death. She had reached out to a close friend, Michael Holland. The words she typed were short, but the gravity of them hit like a punch to the gut. If I get killed tonight, it was Chris. Don't reply, I just want to make sure someone knows. Her message was followed by silence. No follow-up texts, no calls to confirm if everything was all right. It was as if she had spoken a grim truth she knew would soon be sealed in the silence of the night. Michael, who had spoken to Taylor earlier that evening, recalled that she had sounded emotional, upset, and worried. She had even asked him to come pick her up, but when he had checked the cost of the Uber ride, it was simply too much for him to afford. He promised to come the next day instead. The final hours of Taylor's life unfolded in a twisted spiral of tension, fueled by alcohol. As the detectives dug deeper into Taylor's activities that night, they discovered she and Beale had both been drinking heavily. The presence of an empty bottle of Hawkeye vodka next to Taylor's bed confirmed her state of intoxication. There was no doubt she had been battling her demons just as Beale had. But this wasn't just about addiction. This was about violence that had been building in their relationship, and now, it had reached its horrific climax. Taylor and Beale had shared a volatile relationship. In the early days, there had been a sense of hope as they both fought to regain control of their lives, but the darkness of their pasts, their mutual dependence on alcohol, and their unresolved emotional wounds festered beneath the surface. That night, their relationship, strained by addiction and hurtful words, had cracked under the pressure. Michael never heard from Taylor again. The detective then turned to a second set of messages, this time to a high school friend named Nick Seaman. It was just after 11 p.m. when Taylor sent him a simple yet haunting message: "If I get killed it was Chris, don't reply right now, he's nuts." The message ended there, and though Nick hadn't seen it until the morning, the weight of Taylor's final words echoed with a dreadful finality. It was a cry for help, a desperate plea for someone to intervene before it was too late. But no one acted in time. Detectives began to reconstruct the events leading up to Taylor's death. They uncovered evidence that the two had been drinking together earlier that evening. Taylor had reached out for help, signaling that she feared for her life, yet the alcohol had dulled her ability to act in time, leaving her trapped in an escalating argument with Beale. Was Taylor's death an impulsive act of rage, a tragic moment where Beale's volatile emotions spiraled out of control? Or had it been planned? A calculated decision that grew from the bitterness of their relationship and the culmination of months of drinking and tension? As Leonard sat there, sifting through the fragments of Taylor's final hours, the question seemed to grow more complex. Was this a spontaneous tragedy, or had the violence been festering beneath the surface for far longer than anyone had realized? The trap was tightening around Beale. Each piece of evidence added to the mounting portrait of a man struggling to face the horror of what he had done, or perhaps struggling to conceal it. Taylor's last words, the warning sent to her friends, and the hours leading up to her murder, all pointed to a tragic and avoidable outcome. Yet no one had intervened in time. The haunting truth was clear. Taylor had known the danger she was in, but in her final moments she was alone with it. The detectives now faced the painful task of unraveling whether this had been the result of a final impulsive act of violence or the devastating culmination of a relationship doomed by addiction and unchecked rage. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Christopher Beale officially began. The air was thick with anticipation, each person in the room keenly aware that the fate of the accused, and the tragic loss of Taylor Escontrias, hung in the balance. Beale sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor now a hollow shell, his eyes avoiding the gaze of anyone in the courtroom. He was no longer the confused, frantic man in the interrogation room, but a defendant facing the most serious charge of all, first-degree murder. The prosecution wasted no time, setting the stage for their case. They were determined to prove that Beale's actions were not those of a man overwhelmed by drunken rage but the deliberate, calculated acts of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The brutality of the murder, they argued, pointed to intent to kill, not an impulsive act spurred by alcohol. Taylor Escontrias suffered at least 60 separate wounds, the prosecutor began, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a knife. A baseball bat, a knife, a screwdriver, each weapon used methodically, one after another. Blood spattered across multiple rooms of the apartment, indicating that this was not a spontaneous outburst of violence. This was a deliberate, calculated attack. The prosecutor paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. After the attack, Christopher Beale left the apartment. He had the presence of mind to get into his car and drive away, even though he claims to have been blackout drunk. This is not the behavior of someone who has lost control. This is the behavior of a man who knew exactly what he had done. Beale's defense team countered quickly, attempting to shift the focus of the trial. Their argument hinged on one key point: Beale had been too intoxicated to form intent. His memory was fragmented, they claimed, and what happened in those final moments with Taylor had been the result of an emotional breakdown, a crime of passion, not premeditated murder. He was blackout drunk, the defense attorney argued. He wasn't in control of his actions. This wasn't a calculated crime, it was a tragic, uncontrollable outburst. A moment of rage, exacerbated by alcohol, that spiraled into something neither Beale nor Taylor could have predicted. The defense painted a portrait of Beale as a man grappling with addiction, a man who had no recollection of what he had done, someone who had truly snapped in the heat of the moment. They stressed his lack of memory and attempted to evoke sympathy for his struggles, positioning him as a victim of his own demons, rather than a cold-blooded killer. But as the days of testimony unfolded, the prosecution's case only seemed to grow stronger. The evidence was damning: multiple weapons, signs of a violent struggle, and the way Beale had managed to drive away from the scene. The details of the attack, the bloodshed, and the movement throughout the apartment all spoke to one fact: the attack had lasted far longer than an impulsive act would allow. Then came the moment that would shift the trial in an unexpected direction. Beale took the witness stand. At first, his testimony seemed to follow the same script he had rehearsed with his defense team. He had been drunk, blackout drunk, unable to remember most of what had happened. But as the prosecution pressed him, asking questions about the attack, something shifted. Beale began to change his story. His recollections grew increasingly erratic. I didn't mean to hurt her," Beale stammered. "I was just angry. I thought she was going to leave me. I thought I had to stop it, but then it's all a blur. I don't know what happened after the bat. I didn't mean to kill her. I thought I was just putting her out of her misery." The prosecutor, sensing an opening, pressed him further. "So now you're telling us that you were in control enough to stab her with a knife, to use a screwdriver, but you weren't in control enough to know what you were doing?" Beale hesitated, his face contorting with frustration and confusion. I don't know. I was so angry. I didn't think about it. It was all a blur. Maybe I did it, but I didn't want to. I thought I was just helping her." The jury sat in stunned silence as Beale's story grew more contradictory. His shifting recollections, from claiming a blackout to now suggesting he was helping Taylor, further muddied the waters of his defense. His words seemed rehearsed, as if he was grasping for a way to explain what had happened, anything to avoid the truth that the evidence was stacking up against him. The tension in the room was palpable. The jury had to decide: was Beale's story one of a man who had blacked out and killed in a moment of uncontrollable rage? Or was he a man who had carefully planned and executed a brutal murder, using alcohol as a convenient excuse to cover his tracks? As the trial drew to a close, the jury was left with a difficult task. Beale had changed his story so many times that it was unclear which version was the truth, or if any of them were. His defense of being too drunk to form intent was undermined by his own actions after the murder, leaving the scene, getting into his car, and not calling for help. The brutality of the attack, the multiple weapons used, and the evidence of movement around the apartment painted a picture of a premeditated crime, not an impulsive outburst. With the courtroom holding its breath, the jury deliberated. The fate of Christopher Beale, and the truth of what happened that tragic night, would soon be decided. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed back into the room after deliberating for what felt like an eternity. The tension was thick, the weight of Taylor Escontrias' life, and the brutality of her death, hanging over every person present. All eyes were on the jury as they took their seats, their faces unreadable, their minds made up. Christopher Beale sat motionless at the defendant's table, his hands clenched tightly together. His expression was blank, a mask of tension and resignation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice steady but carrying the gravity of the moment. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman replied, his voice calm but carrying a sense of finality. "We find the defendant, Christopher Beale, guilty of first-degree murder." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, like an earthquake reverberating through the room. Beale's face fell, his once stoic demeanor cracking, the reality of his conviction sinking in. He had fought for his freedom, for his innocence, but now there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. The brutality of what he had done had been undeniable, and the jury had seen through the lies and confusion he had tried to weave. As the verdict was read, Taylor's family sat in the front row, their expressions a mix of sorrow and quiet relief. They had waited so long for justice, for their daughter, sister, and mother to be acknowledged as more than just a victim of violence. The prosecutor turned to them, nodding gently as if to say, "The truth is finally known." Beale was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a final, irrevocable punishment for his crime. As the judge pronounced the sentence, the courtroom remained in a somber silence. Beale's family, though devastated by the verdict, held their breath, as though knowing there was no coming back from the horrors that had unfolded. Beale's own face showed a mix of disbelief and despair as the reality of the consequences finally set in. He had taken a life, Taylor's life, and no amount of denial or explanation could change that now. But as the sentence was handed down, the focus shifted to those who had been left behind. The true emotional impact of the trial came not from the cold words of the law, but from the voices of those who had loved Taylor. Her family stood and spoke, each one sharing their grief and love for the woman they had lost. Taylor's mother, Lisa, was the first to speak. Her voice quivered, raw with emotion. Taylor was a beautiful soul. She had her flaws like we all do, but she was the best mother to her children. She made mistakes, yes, but she never deserved what happened to her. She deserved so much more. We all did. She was a light, and now that light is gone. But we'll keep her alive in our hearts, in our memories. Her words echoed in the courtroom, bringing tears to the eyes of those who had followed the case. Taylor had not been defined by her struggles with addiction or the tragic circumstances of her death. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman full of potential and love, cut short by violence. The court had delivered its verdict, but it was her family's testimony that delivered the final, unforgettable impact. Taylor's life and her death were not just a case, they were a painful reminder of how addiction, mental health struggles, and violence often intersect in relationships, leaving destruction in their wake. Beale's sentence was final, but there was a lingering unease. His life behind bars would never bring Taylor back, but what about the relationships that mirrored Taylor and Beale's? What about the stories of others trapped in the cycle of addiction and violence, where the lines between love and harm blur so deeply? The documentary ends with an open-ended reflection. Taylor's story is a tragic one, but it's also a reminder of the often hidden, unseen struggles many face in abusive relationships. How many people, like Taylor, suffer in silence, their cries for help drowned out by the very systems they believe will protect them? And what was it in Beale's past, his own struggles, his deep-seated anger, or the alcoholism, that fueled the violence that night? Was there more to their relationship than anyone could have known? The weight of the questions hanging in the air, unanswered. Sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one we never see coming, the darkness that hides behind closed doors. The story of Taylor Escontrias will never be forgotten, but the real questions remain: how many more stories like hers are out there? And how can we, as a society, begin to address the roots of such violence before it's too late?